If Kurt didn't die, would Dave Grohl still be Nirvana's drummer? According to Michael Azerrad, Kurt Cobain's official biographer, at one point, Kurt was strongly considering firing Dave Grohl. For his part, Screaming Trees drummer Mark Pickerel says something similar. According to Mark, Kurt wanted to use other drummers for Nirvana's next album. Yes, drummers, plural. It's an interesting quote from Mark, which I'll be sharing a bit later. The overall point that I'm making here is it's not a guarantee Dave would have continued with Nirvana if Kurt didn't die. Heck, who knows how long Nirvana itself would have continued even if Kurt lived. It's well documented Kurt was heading in a different direction musically and that he was fed up with the intensity of Nirvana's fame. Perhaps the fourth Nirvana record, the next one, would have been the final album from the band. In any case, what we do know is that, of course, Nirvana did end. In this video, I want to take a look at how Kurt's death impacted Dave Grohl. I'm going to share with you a few quotes from Dave regarding Kurt Cobain's death. Then, I'm going to share with you a few quotes about Kurt contemplating firing Dave Grohl. Now, perhaps Kurt's statements about reducing Dave's position in the band were just said out of emotion. Maybe he wasn't really serious about it. But regardless, again, it was his official biographer, Michael Azerrad, who mentioned this. The reason I'm bringing this up in this video is because I don't think there should be any illusions that Dave started the Foo Fighters purely as a reaction to Kurt's death. Even if Kurt had lived, Dave might have been out of Nirvana relatively soon. And in that situation, I still think he would have gone on to start the Foo Fighters. Some people believe Dave started writing his own music as a way to cope with Kurt's death. But in reality, Dave was already writing his own music while he was in Nirvana. Most notably the song Marigold, which Nirvana did a recording of with producer Steve Albini during the making of In Utero. I'll be showing you a clip from my interview with Steve Albini where he discusses this. And so bottom line, if Dave Grohl was fired from Nirvana, he would have naturally gone on to start the Foo Fighters or some other band anyways. It didn't take Kurt dying for Dave to make his own music. That's the point I'm making here. Now, with all that said, the following is a quote from Dave Grohl regarding Kurt Cobain's death and the impact it had on him. It's not clear exactly when this is from, but I believe it's from the 90s. Quote, "Not many people understand what I'm going through, and I don't expect them to. I don't expect people to be nice or understanding or compassionate because it happens so rarely. I think about Kurt every day, and I miss him, and I realize that I miss him. But at the same time, things keep going, and I've got to make sure things keep moving for me. I don't know if the Foo Fighters make anyone else feel better. I just know I have to do it for myself. I have to feel like I'm moving forward." After Kurt's death, I was confused as I've ever been. To continue playing music almost seemed in vain. I was always going to be that guy from Kurt Cobain's band, and I knew that. I wasn't even sure if I had the desire to make music anymore. Then, one day, I received a postcard from a fellow Seattle band who had also lost a member. It said, "We know what you're going through. The desire to play music is gone for now, but it will return. Don't worry." That letter saved my life, because as much as I missed Kurt, and as much as I felt so lost, I knew there was only one thing that I was truly cut out to do, and that was music. I know that sounds really corny, but I honestly felt that. I decided to do what I had always wanted to do since the first time I'd recorded a song all by myself. I was going to book a week in a 24-track studio, choose the best stuff I'd ever written out of the 30 to 40 songs that I had piled up, and really concentrate on them in a real studio. End quote. The following is from Dave Grohl's book, The Storyteller. Quote, "He's gone, Dave. My knees gave out and I dropped the phone as I fell to my bedroom floor, covering my face with my hands as I began to cry. He was gone. The shy young man who had offered me an apple upon our first introduction at the Seattle airport was gone. My quiet, introverted roommate who I'd shared a tiny little apartment with in Olympia was gone. The loving father who played with his beautiful baby daughter backstage every night before each show was gone. I was overcome with a more profound sadness than I had ever imagined. I couldn't speak, I couldn't think, I couldn't stand, I couldn't breathe. I could only picture his face, knowing that I would never see him again. I would never see his strange, flat fingers, or his skinny elbows, or his piercing blue eyes, because he was gone, forever." Moments later, the phone rang again. Still on the floor, I answered, barely able to speak through the tears and hyperventilation. "Hold on, he's not dead, he's still alive." I jumped up from the soft carpet with my heart racing wildly. "Wait, are you sure?" I asked frantically. "Yes, he's still in the hospital, but he's gonna make it, Dave. He's gonna make it." In the course of 5 minutes, I had gone from the darkest day of my entire life to feeling born again. I hung up the phone. I was in shock. I was numb. I wanted to laugh or cry or have a complete nervous breakdown. I was in a state of emotional limbo. I didn't know what to feel. This was my first brush with death, and I was left utterly confused. I now knew the shattering pain of loss, but only for a brief moment before it was pushed aside like a hideous prank. My process of mourning was forever changed. From that day forward, losing someone close to me became a complicated exercise in waiting for that call to tell me it was all just a mistake, that everything was fine, and then begging the pain to come to the surface when the phone never rang. You cannot predict a person's sudden passing, but there are certain people in life that you prepare yourself to lose for whatever reason. You foolishly try to protect yourself by building a wall around your heart as a sort of preemptive defense mechanism so that when you do get that call, you are prepared somehow. Like being emotionally vaccinated, you already have built up an immunity to their inevitable passing. But this never works. It was March 3rd, 1994, when I woke up that morning in Seattle to the news that Kurt had overdosed in a hotel room in Rome. I immediately turned on the news and saw images of him strapped to a gurney as he was being rushed to the hospital in an ambulance. So I frantically began calling everyone on our team to see what was going on, praying that it was just another accidental overdose, something that had happened before. There was confusion and conflicting reports. Some were painfully dire. Some were encouraging. But no matter how much I wanted to be there, I was 5,000 miles away, feeling totally helpless. After all, I had just seen Kurt 2 nights before in Munich playing what would tragically become the last Nirvana show. From that day forward, I built my walls higher. And 36 days later, they closed in. News of Kurt's death came early in the morning on April 8th, though this time it was real. He was gone. There was no second phone call to right the wrong, to turn the tragedy around. It was final. I hung up the phone and waited for that same shattering pain to bring me to my knees again. But it didn't come. It was stuck somewhere deep within me, blocked by the trauma from a month before where I had been left in a state of conflicted emotional confusion. I don't remember much of that day other than turning on the news and hearing his name over and over again. Kurt Cobain, Kurt Cobain, Kurt Cobain. Each time his name was said, it slowly chipped away at the armor that I had designed to guard my heart. Kurt Cobain, Kurt Cobain, Kurt Cobain. I waited for the armor to be pierced, sending me to the floor one more time, but I wouldn't let it. I fought back, too afraid to feel that pain again. Kurt was more than just a name to me. He was a friend, he was a father, he was a son, he was an artist, he was a human being, and over time he had become the center of our universe, the point that our entire world orbited. But he was still just a young man with so much to look forward to. We had so much to look forward to. That night, we all joined together at his home to somehow try to comfort each other. But the comfort was hard to find, because no matter how many brushes with death he may have had, no one had imagined it would be like this. At least not me. There was shock, followed by despair, followed by remembrance, returning to shock. I looked around the living room full of people, all the different lives that he touched, each in a different way. Family members, lifelong friends, and more recent acquaintances, all mourning in their own ways. Life would never be the same for any of us, and we were now all forever bonded by this devastating event, a wound that would certainly scar. For years, I couldn't drive within a mile of that house on Lake Washington without being shaken by crippling anxiety, remembering the sound of those cries. To this day, I am often overcome with the same profound sadness that set me to the floor the first time I was told Kurt had died. Is it time that dictates the depth of your grief when losing someone? Is the emotional relevance simply determined by the number of days that you spent together? Those 3.5 years that I knew Kurt, a relatively small window of time in the chronology of my life, shaped and in some ways still define who I am today. End quote. In September of 2021, Michael Azerrad, Kurt Cobain's official biographer, wrote a piece for The New Yorker where he dove deep into his history with Nirvana. One of the standout things that Michael Azerrad said in this piece is that at one point, Kurt Cobain wanted to fire Dave Grohl. As a matter of fact, Kurt was yelling about it. The following is from Michael Azerrad's piece for The New Yorker. Quote, "Everyone in the band felt some sort of tension, even if they tried to make light of it. Kurt, Chris Novoselic, and Dave Grohl felt the enormous pressure of being a world-famous rock group and resented the invasive journalism that comes with it. There were tensions within the band too. Once, I stopped by Kurt's hotel room, where he started yelling that he wanted to fire Dave, unquestionably one of the great rock drummers, for being an unsubtle and unspontaneous musician. The thing was, Dave was standing in the room right next door. I hissed at Kurt, 'He can hear.' 'I don't care,' Kurt yelled back, more at the adjoining wall than me. I was sure that Dave heard the whole thing. Regardless, Dave was already aware of Kurt's feelings. He told his biographer, Paul Brannigan, that on a flight from Seattle to LA, he had overheard Kurt bad-mouthing his drumming 2 rows back. Once they landed, Dave told their trusty Scottish tour manager, Alex McLeod, that he was quitting the band after the last scheduled show. McLeod talked him out of it. End quote. End quote. In October of 2021, the publication Vulture released an interview with Dave Grohl. In this interview, Dave Grohl reflected on how at one point Kurt Cobain was considering firing him from Nirvana. Dave was asked the following question during the interview. Quote, Michael Azerrad wrote a piece recently with stories from his time around Nirvana, and one stuck out. He said there was a night during the American tour for In Utero when Kurt was yelling in his hotel room about firing you. Michael Azerrad told Kurt it was perfectly plausible that you, being in the room next door, had heard him. I wondered if you did. End quote. This was Dave's response. Quote, I hadn't, but I have kind of a different version of that story. We were on our way to Los Angeles to start production rehearsals for the In Utero tour, and I was sitting a few rows ahead of Kurt and Chris. I could hear Kurt saying, I think we need a drummer that's more rudimental, along the lines of Dan Peters. End quote. Dan Peters, of course, was the last drummer that Nirvana had worked with prior to hiring Dave Grohl. Dan Peters is known predominantly for his work with Mudhoney, but he has done other work as well, including a short stint with Nirvana in the summer and early fall of 1990. Now, going back to Dave Grohl, in this interview with Vulture from October of 2021, he elaborated further on what his reaction was when he heard Kurt Cobain say they wanted a drummer along the lines of Dan Peters. Quote, I was really upset because I thought things were okay. I talked to Chris and I said, is that really what you guys want to do? Because if that's what you want, maybe just let me know and we can call it a day. I eventually talked to Kurt about it and he said, no, that's not what we want to do. I just felt like it's up to you guys what kind of drummer you really want. But they decided I should stay. End quote. Dave was then asked the following. How close was the band to coming apart or being completely restructured? This is what Dave had to say. Quote, honestly, in that last year, you would wake up every day not knowing what was going to happen next. We were on shaky ground for a lot of reasons. The biggest being that the sudden rise to fame in that band was traumatic. I can't speak for Kurt, and I don't usually because he's not around to speak for himself. Each of us dealt with it in different ways, but ultimately, that's a hard thing to navigate. We had shunned the mainstream commercial appeal, and were perfectly happy in our world behind the shadows. But then, we became one of them. How do you process that? There was a lot of chaos within and outside the band. You had to hang on for dear life and hope the ride didn't stop. End quote. Furthermore, Dave Grohl did tell biographer Paul Brannigan that he did overhear Kurt talking badly about him on a plane. This was mentioned in Dave's biography, This Is a Call, which was released in 2011. In this biography, This Is a Call, Dave also confirms that he wanted to quit the band because he was fed up with the tension in Nirvana and was upset about what Kurt had said on the plane. Their tour manager, Alex McLeod, talked him out of it. End quote. The following is a really interesting quote from Screaming Trees drummer Mark Pickerel. In an interview with journalist Greg Prado for the book Grunge is Dead, Mark Pickerel stated that Kurt Cobain said to him, he wanted to reduce Dave Grohl's position in the band and bring in 2 additional drummers to record the next Nirvana album. Those drummers being himself, Mark Pickerel, and Dale Crover. Quote, one time, Kurt, Chris, and I ended up sitting on a flight together to Los Angeles. They were flying down to have meetings and to rehearse for the In Utero tour, I'm pretty sure. I hadn't seen Kurt or Chris for maybe 2 years. I ended up sitting in the very last row of the airplane. I could see Chris was occupying probably seat D. I was seat E, and I sat next to him. The plane was almost done loading when I heard what sounded like someone with Tourette's barking out bizarre comments, really incohesive statements filled with vulgarity. As the voice got closer, I looked up to see that it was Kurt approaching the last row. The only seat available left on the plane was the one next to me. It was strange because I just bought the issue of Details magazine with Nirvana on the cover. I was going to read the interview on the way to LA. Kurt said, I haven't had the chance to read it yet. Kurt continues, it was really strange I ran into you because I was just listening to Mark Lanigan's The Winding Sheet album and I love your drumming on it. So then, he asked if he could read my issue of Details. While Kurt was reading the interview, he started making comments about how disgusted he was, or rather how frustrated he was, with some of the comments Dave made in the interview. He was frustrated with Dave becoming more comfortable being a spokesperson within the band, or being a voice in the band. I think for some reason that was something Kurt didn't really appreciate or didn't want to see happening. He and Christ went back and forth. Christ must have become the person in the band who was the peacekeeper. While he might have echoed some of Kurt's concerns, Christ, I think, wanted to see the band continue to move forward, get along, and learn how to live and work together professionally. This whole Details magazine column and Kurt being reminded of the Winding Sheet sessions prompted a conversation about having me and Dale Crover play on the next Nirvana record. He wanted the drumming responsibilities to be split between Dave Grohl, myself, and Dale. He wanted to hear the band's sound expand, and because of my playing on the Jury sessions and Mark Lanigan's solo record, for some of the songs that required maybe a lighter touch, he wanted to bring me in. It seemed that Christ was a little more reluctant to pursue that. I think he saw it as something that would cause a lot of tension within the band, considering they were already starting to crack up. But Kurt definitely was excited about it. Of course, I was really excited about it. He gave me his home phone number and address. I remember talking about our different favorite records. I was asking him if he ever spent time listening to Gun Club's Fire of Love, which was a favorite record of mine. He hadn't, as well as a few other favorites of mine. Since I owned a record shop, I sent him a package of Fire of Love, as well as I think the Gun Club's Mother Juno, and of all records, the most current Talk records at the time. Because he was talking about wanting to do quieter music, and Talk had just released a couple of bizarre, quiet, depressing records, The Laughingstock and Spirit of Eden. We talked on the phone a couple of times after that. End quote. During one of my interviews with Steve Albini, the producer of In Utero, he went deep into detail about the making of that album and some of the tensions behind the scenes. One of the things which really complicated the dynamics within Nirvana was all the corporate pressure on top of the band. That pressure not only impacted Dave, Kurt, and Chris, but also the people around them. According to Albini, Nirvana's record label hated his production work on In Utero. They did not like the way Albini recorded the band, and they hated the fact that Nirvana even went with Albini in the first place. And so, according to Steve, Nirvana's label tried to destroy his career completely, and they almost succeeded. Steve went bankrupt. It's a crazy story he shared with me in one of our interviews. I'm going to share that clip with you in a moment. After this Albini clip, I'm going to share with you a few other clips from Nirvana-related interviews I've done where people who worked with the band and the Foo Fighters as well talk about the anxiety and the emotional trauma of Kurt's death, how it impacted Dave Grohl, how it may have impacted the Foo Fighters too, and much more. But first, Steve Albini. Link to the full interview is in the description box below. You specifically stated, potential problems that may run into with the label. When those exact problems you foretold actually did happen, I'm assuming you weren't surprised, so how did you take it?
Like you said, I wasn't surprised. There was an active attempt to wreck my career on the part of the people associated with that record label. And, clearly it didn't work. Like, I'm still here making records every day, and they're all selling insurance or timeshares or something,
Yeah.
So I don't feel bad about the way things turned out, but that was a rough year.
I'm really sorry you had to go through that. When did you first realize that this was happening, that this was starting to develop these problems?
Well, the first inkling was when the band called me and said, yeah, the record label and the management hate the record. They want us to redo it all. And I was like, yeah, I kind of saw that one coming. I mean, I think the trajectory of that record, that is them going off to make the record on their own, the record label stamping their feet about it and trying to get them to change it, them ultimately making some changes, the record coming out in a way that was less than satisfying for me, given that their record label and their management tried to scapegoat me like pretty aggressively prior to the release. Like, all of that whole trajectory, I think that was kind of preordained. I don't think there's any way they could have gotten out of that record without something like that happening. Whoever their engineer was, something on that spectrum was going to happen. Some combination of those events was going to happen. Given that it did, I feel like they navigated it about as well as anybody could. For my part, I might have been... I was more of a prick then. I was more like willing to irritate people. And so I think I was probably I was probably a little coarser about my reaction to all of those things than was necessary. And I'd like to think that I wouldn't behave that way now. It was a very dark time for me. The year after I did that record, I went completely broke the year after making that record. There was an aggressive campaign on the part of Geffen Records to discredit me or embarrass me or try to cause me harm, which was effective in that I lost a lot of business in the intervening year or so. But I don't personalize that toward the band. I feel like the band were the one party in all of this who were not taking shots at me, you know?
Yeah.
They were very circumspect when they were talking about the process of making the record in interviews and stuff. Like they didn't want to ruffle any feathers. And so they didn't personalize their complaints very much. I'm gratified by the fact that they didn't scapegoat me to the extent, you know, that their record label and their management did. It was a surreal experience to have this big corporation have invested a lot of money and their sort of publicity capital in a record by the biggest band in the world, and have those very selfsame people shit talking me to music journalists and other people in the music business and actively trying to cause me harm. That was a very surreal experience for them to be shitting on this record that was obviously very important to them. From a business standpoint, it was going to be a huge record. And I just didn't get why they were shitting on the record. And then as a secondary effect, shitting on me. I just didn't get it. And it was an unpleasant period for me. The year after making that record, I saw a big drop off in my normal clientele. Like the smaller bands that I was working with, the independent bands, a lot of them were suspicious of me now because I'd worked on this big hit record, and that made them suspicious of me and my motives. Like, there was a kind of a normal career trajectory where somebody would start out in the underground and they would start to get noticed, and then they would become sort of a mainstream player and then unavailable to anybody who wasn't a big name.
Yeah.
Something similar to that had happened with Butch Vig, like who was a hero in the underground in the punk scene. Then his name was associated with Nirvana, and suddenly none of the bands that were his bread and butter in the years prior, none of them could get him to answer a phone call. And that's just a result of him moving into a sort of a professional tier where those bands didn't have access, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there was a suspicion of me that was sort of expected to happen with me, that I would now be unavailable to all of my normal clientele. So that normal clientele disappeared or dropped off dramatically. And then the sort of mainstream or major label artists were being actively discouraged from working with me. And I know this because I have friends who were in the process of making records in the year or two after that, who were told explicitly by their handlers that they were not allowed to work with me. They could work with basically anybody else. They just weren't allowed to work with me.
That's crazy that this happened to you.
Well, it was a boys' club. It was a closed circle in the mainstream music business, and I represented a way of working that would negate that network. And so I'm not surprised at all that people were discouraged from working with me.
But I can imagine that there must have been other individuals who were also very much in line with the punk ethos. Why were they so intimidated by you in particular?
I don't know that people were intimidated by me. I think that people saw me as a liability. Like if you're involved with a big record label and your relationship with them is somewhat fragile, meaning that they could wreck you, they could ruin your career, you would not want to antagonize those people. by working with someone that they saw as an obstacle, or that they saw as someone that they saw as an impediment to them going through their normal modes of behavior. And then if you were a small band and you aspired to being picked up by one of these big record labels, and it was made clear to you that I was a pariah in that world, you also wouldn't want to associate yourself with me, because you wouldn't want to be tarred with this brush of, oh, they're a defiant indie band, and they would close some doors on themselves if they did that. So I basically had to rebuild my clientele from the deep underground network, from the peer group of people who were not part of that aspirational world. And I had, existing clients, people that I had worked with for years that stuck with me, but I had to rebuild my new clientele from the ground up, basically.
Jeez.
I'll never forget the moment. There was a moment, maybe 6 months or so after the release of that record, where I did the books on the studio, and I paid all the utilities, and I paid the salaries for the other employees, and I paid the insurance, and I paid everything, and I had 50 cents in the bank. Like, my bank balance after paying all my bills and doing payroll and the mortgage and everything, my bank balance was 50 cents. And that was, unusual for me at the time, because I had been working very steadily, and I had built up a bit of a cushion, which allowed me to survive that fallow period. The band made the record on their own terms. There was also a song, one of Dave Grohl's songs, Marigold, that ended up being used as a B-side that was recorded during the same sessions.
Did you record the Marigold record?
Recorded the basic recording of it, but the greater production of it, that is the overdubs and the mixing and everything, Dave Grohl did that as a sort of a side hustle with Bob Weston as the principal engineer. Bob Weston was there with me the whole time. He was there to make sure that if there were technical problems, that we could get stuff fixed on the spot.
Hey guys, now I'm going to cycle back to Kurt Cobain's death and how it impacted Dave Grohl and the people within Nirvana's circle. I'm going to show you clips from my interviews with Nirvana guitar tech Ernie Bailey, Nirvana photographer Charles Peterson, Foo Fighters mixer Chris Sheldon, and journalist Alan Cross. If you want to see any of the full interviews, they're linked in the description box below. Is there any one show that has some sort of special meaning for you that you experienced?
I think the New Music Seminar show in New York is probably one of the most memorable, and that is because it was exciting. We were going to go out there and debut the In Utero album. Nobody had heard it, and all eyes were kind of on the band as to what the follow-up to Nevermind was going to be. But I remember when we were setting up for it, we were gearing up for sound check, and we got a call saying to tear it all down and to pack the truck up, and that Kurt had died, that they had found him, and that he had turned blue. And it's one of those just weird things where you're in shock, and 15-20 minutes later you get another call saying, no, we got him moving, so let's hold off, put it all back, and we're doing the show. So I remember just thinking, like, it's like, how is this going to be any good? How is this going to be a good show? And they came out and they were unbelievable. It was the best I'd seen them in a long, long, long time. Like, they were phenomenal that night. So, wow. Yeah, so I think it was not only was it like sonically one of the most gratifying shows, but also just as an emotional roller coaster. It's something where you walked out at the end of that night just going, oh, that was that day.
That's crazy. So if I may ask, if you don't want to talk about it, no problem. You just mentioned now, when you heard Kurt died, you were shocked and you heard he wasn't dead. Mm-hmm. When the actual news of him passing away came out, did you believe it at first?
No, I didn't. It was one of those things where you sort of felt like, oh, okay, well, you're familiar with this drill, and we'll just give it a little time. And, as the events, as the day progressed, there was just more and more things, seeing it on TV and seeing and hearing things that you couldn't believe what you were hearing. And they were absolutes.
So you started working with the Foo Fighters after the fact. Were you surprised that you got back into music? Because I've heard interviews of Dave where he said he just he felt he had to move on. He had to keep making music. He had to go forward. But after he needed some time off first. Did you feel the same way?
Yeah, I think that I was probably more uncertain as to what would happen. Well, shortly after Nirvana ended, I got a job offer to go work for the Rolling Stones as a bass tech. Bill Wyman had just left. And so I remember declining that and just thinking that, the Stones have been around forever. They've got a road crew that have been around forever. And, with Nirvana, you had this good fortune that these were your friends, and that, there's not a lot of pressure on you, in that way. So this would be going to work for a really big band with kind of a hardened road crew where you'd be the new person, and you've just gone through something that you're just not emotionally prepared to do much of anything, make breakfast. So, so I remember after that year had passed, after Kurt was gone, it was really difficult. And part of it is this experience of somebody who is in your circle being a public figure who passes. It's really unlike, anything else, because, I, at the time, it's one of those things where it's no secret that you work for this band. Most of your friends know this, and a lot of people around you know this. Well, something like this happens, and even though this isn't somebody that all your friends work with or know on a first-hand basis, their losses are real as well. They've lost somebody that they were, they paid attention to, and somebody that they enjoy. And the first thing they feel like they need to do is to reach out to you and to connect. And so a normal process is, if you were to lose somebody in your circle, probably nobody knows it unless you announce it or share it with somebody. So often we'll go to work and we'll get lost in our work as a way to process this. And you might have a friend at this work that you enjoy talking to and getting their perspective with. And so I think, in a typical scenario, you would share these things, and you would sort of dole out your grief according to your readiness, if you're prepared to. But this was something where you're just being inundated with, usually the lead-in was like, "Hey, I've been thinking about you. How you doing?" It's like, "Oh, pretty good." Well, I can't stop thinking about it. Like, "Oh, okay." Here we go again. And it was just a constant. It was over and over and over. And so it was just something that you really couldn't escape. And so I remember after a year when Dave called up, I knew that he had the Foo Fighter, project rolling, and he said, "Hey, we're going to get in a van and go on tour in a couple of days. You want to just jump in and just go?" And it was just nearly an impulsive decision, but it was like, yeah, let's go. I just want to get out of here. And it was the best thing you could have ever done. It was just to get out of your life for a minute, to get out of Seattle and to get out of your routine and just get in the van and just go. And we were productive again and doing something new. And it was fantastic. And I think the only thing that was sort of bizarre was that where we couldn't fully escape was that every night we were looking at people in the front row, and a good number of them were wearing a shirt with Kurt's face staring at you all night. And so you couldn't completely, get lost in this thing, which is fine.
That's crazy. Thank you so much for sharing that. I really, really appreciate it. It's been 26 years. Are the feelings still as raw as they were back then, or how do you deal with it now?
No, in fact, but the funny thing is that they took a really long time, and it was probably about 5 years ago that I realized you were finally at a point where it didn't really affect you in the same way that it did for a long time. And that was when this idea of this abnormality about, how we, typically, I think, throughout life when somebody passed on, there was this natural process where, just this loss of their presence, and eventually, with the way that memory works and keeping things around, you would begin to lose these details of people, and they would eventually fade, into the past, and you would move forward. Well, this is one where, constantly you go into the grocery store and you'd see, a magazine on the rack, and you're just like, wow, and it was just weekly. And so it was something where I think that in some ways, Kurt changed from being just like a person that you knew to something that's, he's now like a legendary person. He's something that's, he's just nothing like what you understood it to be. And so, and it really sort of like crosses the line to where what you remember is so far gone, and you can just not relate at all to what other people are thinking and feeling.
I hear you. With someone like Kurt, I mean, I was speaking with Alice Wheeler a little while back, and she told me that, Kurt was a very good friend of hers, and when she would hear people like on the TV or radio talking about him like he was this sort of god figure, it kind of bothered her because, yes, he was super famous, but he was a person at the end of the day. In your opinion, what is the biggest misperception of Kurt that there is out there?
I don't know the answer to that because I don't know that I have an understanding of how the mainstream views him. So, I guess I can kind of take a guess that, that he's sort of seen as this perfect product. But yeah, he was a guy who was really good at his job, and he wrote amazing songs. He knew how to sing, and he knew how to be an entertainer. So I guess I sort of view him as that. He's like one of those people who was really exceptional at what he did.
Ernie, thank you so much for your time. I really do appreciate it. This was wonderful. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with me.
Yeah, thank you for treating it with care and for understanding that too, because it is, it's a weird thing, and it's something that I think you understand you have to harden yourself to it in order to process it. It was an incredibly strange experience. Truth is so much greater than fiction, especially in this thing. The reality of it, of this experience was so unlike anything I'd ever imagined.
This is a bit personal, so if you don't want to answer, you don't have to. When, Kurt passed, how did that affect you personally?
Yeah, of course his death touched me. That was really it affected all of us that knew him or had been, I'd seen him 2 weeks previously just on the street, and it was, very deeply affecting. I went to the private memorial for him. I didn't go to the one at the Seattle Center across the street. So, and it's, I think we've all kind of, for a while, we didn't want to talk about it or process it, or, and then as time went by, we're just, you just get more comfortable, and it's just,
The Foo Fighters' second record, The Color and the Shape, was released on May 20th, 1997, about 3 years after Nirvana came to an end. When Dave Grohl first started the Foo Fighters, there were some Nirvana fans who were upset with him for starting a new band. I spoke with Chris Sheldon, the mixer behind The Color and the Shape, and asked him if there was any sort of lingering Nirvana baggage hanging over the making of that record. This is what he had to say.
I wanted to ask you a Nirvana-related question. It's because, this was in 97 or late 96, early 97 when this recording was happening. Nirvana, obviously just ended less than 3 years prior. Was there any sort of Nirvana hangover kind of a feeling going on with the band?
No, not at all. The only thing that was the same really was same manager, John Silver, who again I'd worked with a long time ago with a band. So we had a nice relationship anyway, and John had managed Nirvana. So that was the only thing. It was never really talked about. Maybe they talked about it some more in the recording when they're in the recording studio and talking about stuff. I don't know, but no, not at all. It was not. This was like a whole new thing.
Okay, that's good to hear, because I always I'm very familiar with Nirvana, but I'm not as familiar with the Foo Fighters, and I've heard that especially in the beginning of the Fighters, there was a lot of people who were upset at Dave for actually having started a new band right away.
I can imagine there probably were. I mean, people get upset for the weirdest things, and also people get very proprietorial about music. You know what it's like. You know, it's like you find some new band, and then they have a hit record, and it's like, this is no good. This is my band. I love this. People don't like change. And they say it's like, no. You did Nirvana. You can't do anything else. Certainly not play guitar. But no, there was nothing like that at all. It was very, and I say I was there to do a job, and just get on with it. It was pretty easy, to be honest with you.
In one of my interviews with veteran radio broadcaster Alan Cross, he spoke to me about how he broke the news of Kurt Cobain's death on the radio and what that day was like from a radio broadcaster's perspective.
Something big was happening. We want to be part of it. We want to know as much as we possibly can. But there's no internet. There's no email. There's no YouTube. There's none of that sort of stuff. The only thing that people could do to get the latest news on what was happening was to listen to the radio. That was it. And I remember that day being, okay, this is our JFK moment. This is our John Lennon was shot moment. This is our Elvis Presley died moment. Everybody is depending on us to tell them what's going on. And the way things had evolved was, this was as close to delivering the messages, the news in real time as we could get. Now, we had a teletype, which would spit out the news, from all the different news services. So they were the ones who were gathering the news on our behalf. The only other thing that we could do is get on the phone and call anybody that we might know in Seattle or somebody associated with the band to give us an update on what was going on. And it was really old school. So, at 3:30, Anita, who was my newswoman at the time, came in, handed me the bulletin from the Associated Press, and I read that on the air. And that was like Walter Cronkite taking off his glasses and telling everybody that JFK had died at Parkland Hospital.
That's crazy. And how did that affect you emotionally at all that day? Like, how did you handle that personally?
No, well, you get in a zone. And the zone was, okay, we got a job to do. This is really important. Don't screw it up. Let's be as accurate as we possibly can. And remember that people are depending on us, not any other radio station in the city. Us, and specifically me, because it all happened when I was on the air. So it was me and Anita. And I don't know, I probably have never had a larger audience than I did that day, because news started coming in at 2 o'clock. And then every 10 minutes, Anita would break in with more news. And then I would say something. And so 2 o'clock, 2:15, 2:20, 2:25, 2:45, another newscast at 3 o'clock, 3:15, and then 3:30, there's the news. So for that hour and a half to 2 hours, it was like, wow, because we didn't hear anything. So Kurt was found by the electrician around 9 o'clock in the morning, Seattle time. So that would have been noon. So by the time everything started to drift out, it took about 90 minutes for the first story to move on the wire, saying that a body has been found at 171 Lake Washington Boulevard East. And that is the residence of Kurt Cobain. There seems to be a violent death. So it's like, okay. All right, we know where this is going. It's either one of Kurt's drug buddies has died, or it's Courtney, or it's Kurt.
I was far too young to have any personal recollection of Kurt's death, but in my lifetime, I remember perfectly Chris Cornell's death. I was in my kitchen, and then on the TV, it said, rock star Chris Cornell has passed away, and I was shocked. And then I remember I was driving to work, and it came on the radio, and I actually just pulled over and for a second to listen to the radio and to hear what they're saying. And I just remember being kind of shocked by it. Was Chris Cornell's death similar at all in the way you guys handled it on the radio, or did the internet change that experience?
The internet changed the experience because it got out on Twitter first. So everybody was talking about it by the time we got on the air with it, because, well, the internet moves at the speed of light. And the only thing that moves faster than the speed of light is bad news on the internet. So we couldn't compete because we now, a lot of us, and if we do it right and we use the platform properly, Twitter is the one of the greatest breaking news sources that has ever been invented. That's where I heard about Michael Jackson. So I was coming home from work on the GO train, and I'm flipping through my Twitter feed, and it's like, uh-oh, here it is. And from there, it just exploded.
Yeah, that's nuts. Yeah, I was going to ask you about Chester Bennington, but that was so quickly afterwards. I guess it would have probably been more or less the same kind of.
It was kind of the same thing, but for some reason, well, it was also shocking because Chester seemed to be, I don't know, he just seemed to be such a likable guy, and I think people were, because he was also so very open about his mental state, that a lot of people identified with him, because people who were hurting and so on. So that when he died, there was like, oh no, he couldn't make it. Something happened. Must be a mistake, or he gave up, or man, he must have been in pain. That kind of thing. But it was still the same kind of shocking thing because we didn't expect it. Nobody saw it with both Chris Cornell and with Chester Bennington. Nobody thought.
Do you think that Kurt Cobain's death has made him into more of, I guess, for lack of a better word, a legendary figure than if he was still alive?
Yeah, I think so. Again, he's like Jim Morrison. He's like Jimi Hendrix. He's like Janis Joplin. He, died at that magical age of 27 at the height of his powers.
Do you think the fact that Kurt Cobain passed at such a young age and that Nirvana was only around for a handful of years, do you think that contributed to their fame in a certain way?
Absolutely. The fact that they burned bright and very loud for a very short period of time. I mean, it's such a rock and roll story. It's the kind of thing that people gravitate to. But none of that would have mattered had the music not been any good. Now, what people forget is that when Nirvana released the In Utero album in 1993, people were getting tired of them. They were beginning to move on to other forms of alternative music beyond grunge, Industrial Chili Peppers, Nine Inch Nails, go on. And when the first week in the United States, the In Utero album, I mean, one of the most anticipated records you would think of that decade, it sold less than 200,000 copies in the U.S. the first week. So people were growing tired of it. And when they heard it, it was, well, this isn't Nevermind Part 2, which is what we wanted. It was something a lot more raw, a lot more rugged. And where were the catchy hit songs like, Come As You Are and In Bloom and Smells Like Teen Spirit and so on? It just wasn't received. And it was considered by the record company to be substandard. In fact, they made them remix it. And when the audience heard it, it was like, okay, this is good, but it's not what we expected. Oh, by the way, we've got other alternative music to listen to now. In 91, they didn't. Not really. But now things had completely exploded and opened up.
I heard somewhere, I'm not sure if this is true, but I heard it on a radio station a couple of years back, and it's always stuck in my mind. Somebody was saying that prior to Kurt's death, Pearl Jam was actually starting to become more popular than Nirvana, and then...
No, that's not necessarily true. Pearl Jam had a very long and slow rise. Their album came out in the summer of 91. And people weren't really sure where to categorize them. I mean, we at The Edge held off playing Pearl Jam because we thought they were just another mainstream rock band. Same thing with Alice in Chains. We wouldn't touch Alice in Chains at first because, oh no, that's just another, mainstream rock band and we're an alternative station. But after a while, until really 92, we kind of avoided it, the band because of that. I guess it's a stigma or that preconception of what they were. But by the time Kurt dies, Pearl Jam is definitely bigger than Nirvana. Their Versus album, when it came out, sold more records in a week, almost 900,000 records in a week, and that was a record for that time. So yeah, they were certainly bigger than Nirvana by the time they got to their second album.
Should Kurt not have passed away, and there's this kind of legend around the band, do you think that right now Pearl Jam would have remained the more popular band, quote unquote?
I do, and I think what would have happened is that I think that Nirvana would have probably broken up anyway after the In Utero album, and Kurt would have gone on to do something on his own as a solo artist. If you listen to some of the tapes that he left behind, he was definitely looking to change the kind of music he was making. And I think he was a little bit self-destructive when it came to his idea of being famous. He would not, he had all the money he needed. So he was very much an artist and had, tasted fame. And it's like, okay, I've been there, done that. Now I'm going to go try something else. And so I think that's what would have happened. Kurt would have become some sort of, he might have become like a Mark Lanigan, who was the singer of the Screaming Trees. He might have become somebody, like Josh Homme of Queens of the Stone Age, who went and did all these projects, and his tastes and styles went with the wind. I think that's what would have happened. Nirvana would have never made it through 1995.
Because there were many stories suggesting that Kurt wanted to do some kind of an acoustic Nirvana record with Michael Stipe.
100%. He actually had a plane ticket to go see Michael Stipe in Georgia, and he never got on the plane.
Hey guys, to wrap up this video, I'm going to show you two more interview clips, one with Nirvana producer Jack Endino, the other with Foo Fighters producer Don Zientara, where they share various stories about Dave Grohl.
I wasn't that happy with Chad's drum kit. It didn't record that well. I didn't like the sound all that much. There was a little too much hi-hat bleed on some things.
So you mentioned Chad Channing right now. For me, as a Nirvana fan, I always... first of all, I felt bad that he wasn't inducted to the Hall of Fame. I really felt he should have been. Secondly, I feel like he's kind of overlooked because all the credit to Dave Grohl, he's a monster drummer. He's one of the best drummers out there.
How you compete with Dave Grohl?
Exactly,
He's everywhere.
Exactly. But I feel like because you're competing with someone who's like Dave Grohl, he kind of gets overlooked. As a drummer, from your experience working with him, was he a good drummer to work with?
Yeah, he was great. He's artistically a very good drummer. He's got a good pop sense. As Dave Grohl has pointed out repeatedly, he was playing a lot of Chad Channing's drum parts on Nevermind because the band had demoed a lot of that material while Chad was still in the band. And Grohl has given credit where it's due to that because a lot of the drum arrangements, as it were from Chad. I think the time when you can really hear Dave Grohl playing Dave Grohl drum parts is on In Utero. Mm-hmm. Scentless Apprentice being the best example. That's freaking, there's Dave being Dave, Yeah. It starts with a drum pattern that's completely iconic. So, yeah, Chad doesn't get credit, but Chad, he was not as ambitious as Dave, and nobody plays as hard as Dave. I mean, I don't know how his limbs and joints and muscles can withstand that level of intensity, really, because Chad's a pretty good drummer, but Dave is an animal. So, it's just different people doing different things. Chad has played in a number of other projects years later that I have recorded, actually, where the drumming is marvelous, including some of the songwriting, because Chad is actually a songwriter as well. People don't realize that. He has a couple of albums under the name Before Cars. Yeah. That are pretty nice tunes on those records. He's a pretty good singer. He plays bass well. Yeah, different destinies. What are you going to do?
Yeah, for sure. But, thankfully, from what I've seen, various interviews here and there, it seems that the split with Nirvana was amicable.
More or less. I mean, I think they were just going in different directions. I know Chad wanted to contribute some songwriting, and that wasn't going to happen. You know, it's just whatever. They were after something else. Mm-hmm. Now, you know, they didn't just end up with Dave Grohl initially. They did a tour with Dan Peters. They called up Dale Crover and did a tour with him. So there was a transitional period in there while they were still trying to decide who was going to be in the band. Mm-hmm. So, and, you know, they had to sort of check out these other people. And, you know, it's like, okay, Dan, well, he's great, but he's not quite what we're looking for. Okay, Dale, he's great, but he's in the Melvins, you know. And I wish I'd seen that tour where they played. I think it was in 1990 where they did a tour with Dale. It would have been interesting to see Dale.
I think it would have been the latter end of the summer of that year.
Probably before they went in the studio with Dave Grohl. Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know if the latter ended. When did they record Nevermind?
They recorded Nevermind in the end of May, early June, 91.
Okay, so yeah, it would have been toward the end of 1990 then, probably. Much later, when the deluxe Bleach came out many years later, I reminded Sub Pop that they had a complete live show with Chad Channing on drums recorded at the Pine Street Theater in Portland, and I believe it was from early 1990. And we pulled out the tapes, and I made a mix of that entire show, which is essentially on the double vinyl version of the Bleach reissue. That's the second disc. So sometime in 1990, Chad was still playing with them. And then after that, we'd have to talk about the session that I did with Dan Peters on drums, which was just Sliver, one song. And then I think they did a few shows with Dan Peters. The Motorsports Garage here in Seattle gets mentioned. I was not at the show. And then they did some kind of tour with Dale Crover. Again, I don't know the exact dates. I didn't see those shows. And then he joined the band and they recorded Nevermind.
This is an open-ended question. Of all the songs you've recorded with Nirvana, was there any one in particular that you were most satisfied with how it came out, the recording?
Floyd the Barber, probably.
Really?
Yeah.
And if I may ask why?
The drum sound. I wasn't that happy with Chad's drum kit. Dale, on the other hand, had a very, very good drum kit, and he knew how to tune it and play it. I mean, he was an exemplary drummer. Now, Chad is a pretty damn good drummer himself, but Dale is one of the top drummers in the world, in my estimation. And I mean, he's up there. He's a monument. And even in 1988, Dale was an amazing drummer with a very good sounding kit, and he knew how to tune it. So the thing is, if you're recording on 8 tracks, you only have a few channels to use for the drums. So you can't rely on technical trickery to make the drums sound good. You have to get the sound at the source. It has to be a good sounding kit played in a well-balanced manner. And that is what I had with the songs with Dale, is, you know, just 5 or 6 microphones submixed onto 3 or 4 channels sounded great because he was a good drummer and he had a very, very good sounding drum kit. So that made my recording sound a lot better than an 8-track recording, because it sounded like I had recorded the drums with some full multi-track, you know, array of microphones and technology, and it was really just a great sounding kit. You know, the drums make a lot of difference. So, from a technical angle, I like the way Floyd the Barber and Paper Cuts sound. Also, the fact that I was allowed to remix those specifically for the Bleach record, rather than using the original rough mixes we had made on January 23rd, which is what went on the Incesticide record, was those original mixes that took about 10 minutes each. Floyd the Barber was originally part of those sessions, as was Paper Cuts, but those 2 songs are not on Incesticide. They were on Bleach from the get-go, but I was allowed to mix them more deliberately because it was part of the Bleach sessions. Like, at the time we were doing Bleach, I think they actually did a version of Floyd the Barber with Chad and decided not to use it because we all, even Chad, we agreed, like, no, we can't beat the version with Dale Crover on it. Let's just use that one. And Paper Cuts, I don't know if they ever even played that with Chad. They didn't try and record that. They just said, now we'll just use the Dale version of that one too. So I had a chance, and I'm pretty sure that Kurt added a backing vocal to Paper Cuts during the Bleach sessions. There's a harmony on it, yeah. And so then I, mixed it again from there. So those were, as we were doing Bleach, the plan was to borrow those two songs. Now, Beeswax got added later. It didn't get remixed. It's just the straight up mix from January 23rd, as far as I remember. It might be a different mix than the one that's on Incesticide. You'd have to compare them side by side in order to tell. And since they were mastered at different times by different people, who knows? Plus one is probably from a backup safety copy and one probably isn't. Who knows about that either? I don't know.
Now, of course, one of the important bands from the DC punk scene is Scream, and you have a relationship with the Foo Fighters. So, did your relationship with the Foo Fighters start through Scream?
Yeah, it did. It started through Scream. I stopped in a couple of their practices with the different drummers, including Dave Grohl when they was there. And I know Pete Stahl pretty well. He lives on the West Coast, and his brother Franz. And basically, when Dave was he finished with Nirvana, he asked me to we could do some demos together. And he didn't have a name for the band yet, but he wanted to do some demo songs and enlist some people to play in the band. So we recorded some demos together, and this is, I forgot how many years ago. So we sort of kept on the relationship. I think it's just a musical relationship, which isn't super close, but he lives on the West Coast, of course, and and I live here, and they're all good people. I mean, I try to stick with good people.
So, having recorded the original Foo Fighters demo, what was that experience like? How were the sessions?
I think Dave had his sister play bass. He played drums, and he played bass and guitar and sang. And what happened was basically it was extremely laid back in the sense that, being the producer that he was at the time, he had to produce it. He had to play on all the instruments except for the bass. He had to sort of figure out the songs as it went along. He couldn't become too stressed out or too intense in any one area. And what I saw was when he wanted to play, he had a wireless guitar thing. He basically sat in an easy chair and played guitar parts.
Okay, so you mentioned now that his sister was at the sessions. Did anybody else from Dave Grohl's family show up?
His mother came down for the Foo Fighters sessions, and I talked to her for a little while. But that's all. When they were Scream, they lived in a group house in Springfield, and so and a lot of musical groups do. But they had a group house there that they lived in all together, and made it easy to practice and all that.
Hey, that's cool. Yeah. So what was Dave like as a person, just if you remember?
It was great. He was great. He's a nice guy. Real nice guy. And like I said, very, very low stress in the sense that he knew what he was going for. He knew what he wanted. But he wasn't like jittery to get it and to make you get it or to go along with him. He'll get there. He'll get there. When he wanted to sing, I can't even remember how he did it, but it may have been just a microphone sitting in front of the console singing. It wasn't the type of thing where you think about, okay, let's do it all the traditional ways, and we must do it in this way, and we must have the best microphones and the most acoustic settings for these things. It was more like, let's get the part down, let's listen to it. If it isn't to our liking, or if it doesn't sound the way we want, well, we could do it again. This is a recording studio.
Yeah.
And that's a nice attitude to take, where a creative person could actually just do stuff, keep doing stuff.
So you were saying that, the session was unique for various reasons. Because it was so not cookie cutter, did you ever feel like this might not go so well, or this might come out amazing? Like, was there ever any kind of feeling like that?
No, no, not in the least. One other thing, I mean, good musicians, I was going to say professional musicians, but, not all of them are professional. Some of them are amateur musicians, but they do it very, very well, is they have kind of a routine, but it's a flexible routine. And they know if they sort of follow along through these things, they will get results one way or another. So there was never any question about if it was going to come out correctly. I mean, songs aside, it was going to come out correctly. If the song was bad, okay, it might not have sounded that good. No, people might not have listened to it, but it didn't. And the songs basically came out to their liking because they kept at just pushing ahead. Hey, this is good, but let's try this with there, and try this and try this. A lot of trial and error. Like I said, it's a routine, but it's a very flexible routine where you're in your lane, but that doesn't mean you have to be in the center of the lane exactly all the time. You could veer a little to the left and a little to the right, but you get there. You definitely get there, and that's what people have to realize. You can get there like that, and you have to just sort of be less stressed out about getting it done a certain way, or using a certain amp, or using a certain guitar, or using a certain drum set, or heads on the drums, or a microphone, anything. There's no that it matters less. It does matter, but it matters less.
In the late 1980s, Kurt Cobain and Chris Novoselic, alongside Mark Lanegan and Mark Pickerel from the Screaming Trees, formed a group which would be known as The Jury. On August 20th and 28th, 1989, the band recorded 4 tracks with producer Jack Endino, including a version of Where Did You Sleep Last Night? Later in this video, I'm going to show you a clip from one of my interviews with Jack Endino where he reflects on this. But first, I'm going to share with you a quote from Mark Pickerel where he discusses how the project came together. Quote, "We were all becoming big blues fans during a similar point in time. I think Lanegan approached me with it because he knew that I was already a big Leadbelly fan, and just a blues fan in general. And since Kurt and Chris were both becoming fans of the same genre, we thought it'd be cool to be the first band out of the Northwest that already had some notoriety to try and forge ahead with a different sound, or a different vision. I believe we learned a version of Where Did You Sleep Last Night from a cassette that I had. I think Kurt brought a cassette version of Ain't It a Shame. Grey Goose may have been Lanegan. I think we started exclusively with Leadbelly, and then we were going to branch out from there. The original idea was just to do a session devoted to Leadbelly, and then go back in later on and do some other blues artists as well. Mark's vocals with Kurt's vocals could have led to something really powerful, I think, but the irony is, it was that combination of those two personalities that slowed things down. They were like junior high kids at a dance, a couple of wallflowers. I felt like I was the cheerleader of the entire session, always making suggestions and trying to get us to move in a certain direction, or to try a certain song, or even sometimes suggesting who might sing the song. Neither Mark or Kurt really wanted to take the initiative to make a lot of decisions. It's funny now that everyone's calling the project The Jury, because no one else seemed to be all that excited about the idea at the time. Kurt really wanted to call it Lithium. It seemed as though Mark was satisfied with the name, but not necessarily excited about it. And I don't remember if Chris had an opinion one way or the other about it. But Kurt definitely did not want to call it The Jury. And the funny thing is, I don't really care for that name anymore. But it's a little too late for that. Who knows what we might have done if we'd been able to get together once a year for a couple of weeks. Lanegan and I have massive record collections, so there would have been a wealth of music for us to listen to learn from, research, and recreate. I really regret that it didn't happen." End quote. Here's the Jack Endino clip, guys. If you'd like to see the full interview with Jack Endino, the link is available below.
When people think of Where Did You Sleep Last Night, they often think of the MTV Unplugged version. But you actually recorded, from what I understand, the original one that Mark Lanegan and Kurt Cobain did together. Is this correct?
Correct.
And what was the story there exactly?
I may get this wrong because nobody has asked me about this for a long time. At some point, there was a session where Mark Lanegan and Mark Pickerel, the drummer from the Screaming Trees, and Kurt Cobain and Chris Novoselic were going to come in and record a side project that they'd been doing where they supposedly were writing some songs together. Now, they booked the time, And then apparently they never wrote any songs together, or as Kurt said, well, we wrote some songs together, but we forgot them all. I don't know if it ever happened, actually. Mm-hmm. But he said, what we're going to do instead is we're just going to record some Lead Belly tunes. And I thought, okay. So they came in and recorded, and I think this is when that session took place. They recorded Where Did You Sleep Last Night? They recorded Ain't It a Shame, which is on the box set, and something called Grey Goose, which I had no memory of for years and years because it doesn't have a vocal. It's literally one riff over and over again. It's not very exciting, but there it was on the master tapes when we finally pulled it out. They just, for some reason, nobody bothered singing on it that day. And it ended up on the box set, I think. That was all they managed to do that day. One song with Mark singing, one song with Kurt singing, and an instrumental. And I asked them, what do I put on the log sheet? And they said, I'll call it The Jury. So, okay. So, but it wasn't really a band. But it was the only time I got to record Mark Pickerel drumming with Chris and Kurt. And I think that is where that version of Where Do You Sleep Last Night came from. Because sometime after that, when I was recording Mark Lanigan's first solo record, I think the subject of that song came up and we decided to just put that on the end of it. That's why that song is on the winding sheet. There's another song on the winding sheet called Down in the Dark, where we got Kurt to come in and do a backing vocal, and I'm doing a little electric guitar on it as well. Probably the only thing on which I'm playing guitar with Kurt singing that exists, which is interesting. I haven't really thought about that. Yes, but that was the version, that arrangement of the song, I think, is what inspired Kurt to do the song at the Unplugged session much later.
Really?
Probably so. Although really, Kurt was present when we recorded the Mark Lanigan version, so, I'm sure they arranged it together. Anyway, this is all speculation.
So for you, when you listen to, I guess, the Unplugged version, how does it compare compared to the versions that you were involved with? Like, what do you think of it?
The arrangement is the same. The difference really is the instrumentation and the vocal. He sings it very similar to how Mark Lanigan sings it, but, he puts the sort of Kurt passion into it, really.
Yeah.
Different players, different instrumentation. I think the only thing in common is, Kurt's playing acoustic on it,